Welcome to episode 21 of Juan's World. My goodness, we're moving right along, aren't we? I'm going to be talking about opposites and oppositions again today, and I'm going to promise that this will be a pretty rambling subject matter because I'm going to talk about phrasal verbs, I'm going to talk about opposite prepositions, I'm going to talk about gender, and I'm going to talk about war. Yeah, so I'm going to wander all over the place, but I promise that it will have ultimately a central point, but you'll have to wait to the end to get to it. So meanwhile, let's start at the beginning. Let me start with a story from my son's childhood. When he was a really small boy, an infant, before he even went to school, he used to have real trouble with transitions. If he was playing, he didn't want to stop and have dinner. If he was indoors, he didn't want to go outdoors. If he was outdoors, he didn't want to go indoors. If he was in the car, he didn't want to stop. It was really problematic for us for a long time. So we hit upon a solution, which was to say, okay, Badger, his name was Badger. Here's his photo. He's not, he's not 3 or 4 years old in this, but I will find a picture of him when he was an infant. We used to say, Badger, in 10 minutes we are going to get into the car, or in 10 minutes you need to stop playing because we're going to have lunch. I would give him a warning of about 10 minutes, and then give him another warning in about 5 minutes, and another warning in about 1 minute, and then we would say, okay, now we have to have lunch, or now we have to get in the car. Most of the time it worked, but I remember one famous day, it was so funny to me, I had trouble not falling on the floor laughing. I said to him, okay, Badger, time's up, you know, when the period had ended, time's up, and he looked at me and he said, no, Dad, time's down. And I realized that he thought that the opposite of up was down. So if time is not up, then time must be down. And that was a clear case where up and down are not opposites. Time's up does not have an opposite adjective down. You can negate it. You can say time is not up, but you can't say time is down. But it got me thinking about up and down. And it got me thinking about the ways in which we use prepositions, and sometimes the opposition is not an accurate opposite. And the first one I thought of was the verb throw. So you can throw something up and you can throw something down. Now there is a clear opposite, but we also use the phrase throw up to mean vomit. And there is no opposite throw down, like not vomit, or I don't know what it could possibly be. But at the time I didn't realize. I knew that there were occasions where prepositions did not form opposite verbs, but I didn't understand at the time because I wasn't an ESL teacher. We're talking about 15, 20 years ago. When I became an ESL teacher, I learned about phrasal verbs. And I've known about them intuitively all of my life, of course, but I've never put a name on them, and I've never really understood what a phrasal verb was until I started teaching them. Phrasal verbs, in fact, are very, very difficult for non-native English speakers to learn. Because what you do is you take a verb, and we'll take a different verb. Throw, okay, throw up is a phrasal verb, but let's take look. Look up. Well, you can do that. Okay, I'm going to look up, look down. Okay. That's using a verb and a preposition together, where the preposition means what you think it means, up and down. So I look up and I look down. But we also know, if you're a native speaker, that look up can also mean to find something, like in a dictionary. I don't know the spelling of this word, I will look up the spelling. Or we can say, I'm going to look up my friend Tom, meaning I'm going to meet him at some point. The trouble is I don't know his phone number, so I will look up the phone number in the telephone directory, or these days on the internet. So in this case, look up is a phrasal verb that has multiple meanings. You know, it can mean to research something, to find something. Generally speaking, it means to go in search of something. And it does not have an opposite. You cannot look down because it's not look up, it's a phrasal verb. All right, so there's one complexity. But let's take up and down. Up and down can mean all kinds of things. Okay, you know, obviously it can mean up, like I'm going to walk up this hill, I'm going to walk down the hill. So it has a situational meaning in terms of physical space, you know, spatial up and down. But what about when you say, my voice has gone up? My voice has gone down. What does that have to do with hills or with spatial up and down? There is an answer to that. The simple answer is that it has to do with frequency, that the higher a note is, the higher its frequency. That is, the greater the number of the frequency of the note, and the lower, then the smaller. So up and down can also apply to numerical size or to physical size. My weight has gone up. Actually, it hasn't. My weight is staying pretty much the same. But if your weight goes up or your weight goes down, what you mean is that the number increases or the number decreases. So up and down can be more generally used to apply to increase and decrease. So increase in height, increase in weight, increase in number, increase in volume, increase in all kinds of things. There you can have a contrast. So here's a little experiment for you. Try to think of examples of prepositions where the opposite cannot be used. And think of the opposite, in and out. I came in the room, I went out of the room. That is a clear opposition of the preposition. Can you think of an in that does not have an out, or an out that does not have an in? Okay, there's like point number one. Now, let's talk about right and left. Now, I'm not sure how my camera is working here. Sometimes it looks to me as if it's making mirror videos, and sometimes it looks as if it's making direct video. Anyway, this is my right hand. This is my left hand. Here's another challenge for you. How can you define right and left? That's a very difficult one. See, I can define an even number and an odd number very simply using mathematics. I can say an even number is a number that can be divided by 2 and has no remainder. And conversely, an odd number is a number that when you divide it by 2 leaves a remainder of 1. That's easily defined, and you will all understand that. If you have to understand a little bit of mathematics, but not a whole lot. And there we have an opposite, even and odd. I could do the same for up and down and in and out. But what about right and left? Well, here's another challenge for you. Look it up in the dictionary, because there is no way to define right and left that does not involve some kind of empirical statement about the world. So that, for example, you could say that if you are facing north, right is to the east and left is to the west. But you're talking about compass directions. Or some people will define right as being the side of the body that has typically the smaller part of the heart, and the left has the larger part of the heart, because the right hand generally, not always, some people have weird hearts, but generally the right part of your heart is smaller than your left part of your heart. Because the left part pumps the blood all over your body, whereas the right part just pumps it up and around the lungs, so it doesn't have to do much work. The left part has to do much more work. So we have to use right and left as body parts, or as compass points, or as some other empirical aspect of the world, which is really problematic when it comes to things like right-hand turns, or spins of subatomic particles, or magnetic fields, and so forth. It becomes very complicated, but right and left are distinct opposites. And another question, why do we use Latin terms for right and left, and they mean very different things culturally? The right in Latin is dexter, and we use it in words like dexterous, that he is really dexterous, that means he's really got a lot of physical skill. Or we can say ambidextrous, that means ambi means both, dexterous, that means both the right hand and the left hand are equally skillful. And the left in Latin is sinister. And that translates also into Italian, sinestro, for the left. Why is the left sinister? Why is the left bad? Why is the right good and the left bad? So that perhaps, I haven't checked recently, but when you see cartoons and you see an angel appearing on one of the characters' shoulders and a devil appearing on the other one, I would be very surprised if it were not the case that the angel appears on the right and the devil appears on the left, because the devil is sinister and the angel is dexterous. So opposites have a lot of embedded meaning in our language, and we don't always think about this embedded meaning, but it's there. So let's now move on to gender, male and female. And this is where I have a big problem. So let me first of all make a distinction between sex and gender. In anthropology, we use the term sex to mean biological characteristics. And typically among humans there are two sexes, male and female. Now, I've talked a little bit in other videos about the opposite of male and female, and I don't want to get into that again. Yes, there are some individuals who are not fully male or not fully female biologically. They can be hermaphroditic or somehow or other share sexual characteristics that are both male and female. But typically, a human male either has male sexual organs or female sexual organs, and so is assigned the sex male or female. Now, the big issue is whether biology is destiny. Does having male sexual characteristics lead to male behavior, and female sexual characteristics lead to female behavior? My simple answer is no, it does not. But let's just complexify that a little way by talking about gender now. Gender is not associated with sexual characteristics, but is the analysis of behaviors. So we can talk about male behavior and female behavior, or at least some people can. I hate it, but some people can. And so male behavior is male gender, female behavior is female gender. Now, this is something that is really riddled all throughout our culture. We talk about, for example, a man's man. What is a man's man? I think of Bruce Willis in Die Hard. Right? Man's man. There's a problem and his woman is in trouble and he's the only one who can save them, and he does it by physical action, by brute force, by violence, and by fortitude and persistence. He is a man's man. Versus what I'll call a girly girl. You know, the typical female likes dresses and makeup and high heels, and is always very sensitive and wants to share her feelings and so on and so forth. And that's how gender roles are frequently defined in Western culture. And that's what I want to challenge. I want to challenge this idea that people have male characteristics and female characteristics, and that they can heighten one or the other, so that a person can say, well, I want to display more of my female side. A man can say that, or a woman can say, if I'm going to be the boss, I need to display more of my male side. I find this hopelessly simplistic. I am a father, and I talked about my role with my son earlier on in the video. Well, you know, in fact, I raised my son most of his life, partly because his mother was sick a lot of the time, and his mother died, and I had to take care of him. Did I then have to get my female side exposed? That's what a lot of people would say, that when I was nurturing to him, when I was helpful and kind and sensitive, when I did the cooking, when I did the cleaning, I was doing feminine things or female things. I find that just hopelessly bigoted and prejudiced. I am a man. I am fully a man, and part of my manhood involves being nurturing and kind and tender and sensitive, as well as sometimes getting really angry and not violent. I'm not really a violent person, but I sometimes am a man of action and of strength. Although again, I don't make a particular habit of going to the gym, but I am strong in terms of health. So I am both strong and I am sensitive and I am nurturing, and sometimes I'm not nurturing at all. I think some of my students will happily respond to this video, yes, yeah, there was an awful lot of times when Prof was not particularly nurturing, when he was yelling at me, being a man. Well, I just find that idea of separating characteristics into male characteristics and female characteristics as hopelessly simplistic. But more than that, I find it damaging, because it means that from an early age we are teaching our children, our boys or our girls, don't do that because that's what girls do and you're a boy, or don't do that because you're a girl and that's what boys do. And so we have bad words or negative words for girls who act like boys. We call them tomboys, or we call boys that cry or are oversensitive, we call them sissies. Instead of advancing a more holistic, a more complex person who is both sensitive and tough, that can display both strength and weakness. This is a case where opposition really works against us. And the last case that I'm going to present to you today, and I will continue this next week, is the use of opposition as, first of all, let me say that typically a male thing in Western world, but to use opposition as the way of getting what you want. And this is precisely the opposite of what Christianity supposedly teaches, but it never gets emphasized in Christian teaching for all kinds of reasons. But let me just talk about opposition and war and all of those things that are really not very helpful in terms of having a peaceful or an enjoyable life or culture or what you will. So let's think about the political sphere as an introduction to this. In politics, typically both in England and in the United States, although less so in England now and more so in the United States, there are two major parties, and they see their job as challenging one another, as opposing one another. In England, the party that is not in power is called the opposition party, because they face one another in Parliament. You've got the Parliament on one side, you've got the opposition on the other side, and they face one another so that they can challenge one another. They don't think in terms of agreement, they always think in terms of opposing what the other side is doing. And that's where I want to get to, the disadvantages of a culture that thinks in terms of opposition. Okay, so I'm going to talk about opposition in politics in a little bit more detail, but I'm not going to be able to go into it in great detail because this is not a political science class. But I want to talk about right wing and left wing as they are understood historically in Euro-American culture. And I'm going to start with this idea. Imagine that you've got a whole group of voters in a room, and they're all over the map, men and women, farmers, factory workers, doctors, sailors, they're all over the map. Now, you would not expect them to agree about much of anything because their interests are so different, and their temperaments, their personalities, and all the rest of it are so very different. But what happens in politics in general in the United States now, and historically in Britain for a long time, was that you said, okay, you are all very different, but I'm only going to give you two choices. You can either choose the right wing or the left wing. Now let's just leave alone the fact that there's really a spectrum here, and just look at ideal types. The ideal right-wing type believes in competition, that everybody should work in competition with everybody else, and some winners arise and there are some losers, and that's just the way things work. Some people get rich and some people don't, and kind of the hallmark of capitalism, if you like. Versus the left wing that thinks that everyone should be cooperating, that we can all be different, but we should pool our resources, and out of that common pool we should help those people that need help, and the people with the most should give extra to those who have little. And those two poles, if you like, I mean, I'm being very simplistic, but those two poles lead to numerous arguments, and there's no real way to logically claim that one is better than the other. Like some people on the right will claim that if we're all in competition, that we all improve. When I was growing up in Australia in the 50s and 60s, there were occasionally advertisements on newsreels that would show some children competing in a sprinting race, and the announcer would say, when we all compete, we all get better. That somehow or other, that competition is good for everyone. And that conversely, that if we all cooperate, things won't be as good. And that's the heart of the battle between right and left that's been going on for centuries. That some people believe that we should cooperate, and some people believe we should compete. And the fact of the matter is that even in a society that is heavily competitive, such as capitalist United States right now, there are cooperative ventures, like, for example, the police force, or federal highways and hospitals and so forth. They are socialized because they benefit everyone. Now, the point I want to make is that in modern politics, people are forced to choose. They are only given the choice of the candidate on the right or the candidate on the left. Now, admittedly, in British politics, there has been some effort to find a middle ground, and it kind of works, kind of doesn't work. And there are some countries like Italy where there are just parties all over the place and coalitions of different ones formed at different times. But let's just stick with direct opposition right now, because that's my subject matter and that's my point. The point I'm trying to make is that if you have to choose between, let's say, Republican and Democrat, and that's your choice, this side or that side, that nobody wins. Because you're putting people in opposition to one another, and all it does is it emphasizes the opposition. It emphasizes difference as opposed to the things that you agree upon. And it's getting worse and worse in the United States right now. The polarity is increasing minute by minute. And everybody loses. Everybody. There are no winners in that kind of situation. So this is a case where opposition would be best avoided if we found the liminal or the central or the middle ground. But opposition by its nature creates antagonism towards the opposite. Well, I say by nature, I mean it's not really like physics exactly, but kind of. That what you have are two parties that go head to head, with each attempting to defeat the other, as opposed to finding that liminal or that middle ground where they can find some agreement and perhaps even some power. And it also happens when you create nations and when you create borders, that you create opposition between the nations that exist on either side of the border. And there may very well be a lot of common ground between those nations, but when you create the border, you also create opposition. And that is also the current state of affairs that exists, particularly in the United States right now. Now, I've got a lot more I want to say about opposition, and I'm certainly going to continue it for at least one more video. And I'll get into more cultural complexities at some point. But I want to finish for the moment by telling you about a little experiment I once did in a class I was teaching. The class was called Culture and Personality, and it turned out to be a rather bigger class than I had expected because it was a fairly popular class. So it ended up, I think, with about 50 students in it, a lot. And in those days, I used to like to arrange my classes in a circle because I could move the chairs. And I liked people sitting in a circle because when you sit in a circle, you all see each other. And that to me is really important in and of itself. I can also sit in a circle too so that I can to some extent be equal. I'm not equal, I'm in charge, but there is a certain sense that there is a kind of equality. And everyone can talk to everybody else. You're not looking at the back of heads if you're sitting at the back, or you're not looking just at the board or the teacher and nobody else if you're sitting at the front when you're sitting in rows. When you're sitting in a circle, you're always aware of everybody else. And I used to like that. And in fact, I used to have circular discussions where I would sometimes pose a question and then we would go around the circle and so on. But I couldn't do that in this class. I tried having a double circle and that didn't really work. I tried a lot of different configurations. And one time, I arranged the chairs in the room like the Parliament in Britain. It was with one side facing towards this way and one side facing towards this way. So they were facing each other. And that's the parliamentary system in Britain that originated because the first parliament met in a church choir, and in church choirs the choir faces each other in England. So it's a strange system which is not used in, let's say, the UN or in senates in different countries and so forth. But it is always used in Britain. And what I found was that when I posed questions, when they were facing each other, even though the people on this side, I mean, you want to call them the right wing or the left wing, doesn't matter. You want to call this the right wing or left wing, doesn't matter. You face them opposite each other. When I started posing questions, they immediately opposed each other. This side opposed this side. And they started battling each other simply because of the physical location of their desks in space. It had nothing to do with who they were or what they felt in a larger sense. It had to do with the situation they were placed in. So the point I want to conclude on for now, and I'll continue it next time, is that if you put people in opposition just in a sort of arbitrary way, like Labour versus Tory or Republican versus Democrat, you end up in opposition. And the middle ground, the liminal place, the place of power, the place of consensus, disappears. The opposition takes over. All right, we're going to continue that next time, and meanwhile, if you like what's going on here, then please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.